evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide. Welcome to Vampire Reviews. The date is October 13th. I am making this video for you about Episode 5 of AMC's Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire before I even post my video about Episode 4, because I am traveling next week and I need to get this up for you ahead of time. As a vampire reviewer, I received the first 5 episodes of AMC's Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire about a month ago to plan and prepare these breakdowns. Honestly, most of the time was spent processing? So much to process about this show. But we have reached the end of what I have seen, and now you all have seen it too. If you have AMC Plus, where the episodes are all aired a week ahead of when they actually show up on cable. So we are on the same page. We are caught up. We are in this together, and none of us know what's coming up next after this episode. Whew. Another one that, despite how absolutely shocking things were, I enjoyed simply for the fact that so much of it was so unexpected because it just veered so far away from the books. Twists and turns we just never saw coming from this. And like I said before, the show really is best when it just lets itself be its own thing. So here we go. Episode 5, A Vile Hunger for Your Hammering Heart. Another book quote title that doesn't actually get dropped in the show, and with good reason. In the book, Louis is telling Claudia why he drank her blood when she was human, why he almost killed her, how he felt for her this vile, unsupportable hunger for her hammering heart that he just wanted to eat. Of course, Louis in the show never fed on Claudia or felt any hunger for her at all, but the sense of betrayal Claudia feels in the book when Louis confesses this leads to a rift between them, and even though Louis already confessed last episode how it was his fault that Claudia needed rescuing from the fire in the first place, and it didn't bother her at the time, in this episode, the rift will come about in a new way. So the title represents Louis's feelings of how he failed his daughter and Claudia's bitterness toward him for it. Episode 4 ended with 19-year-old Claudia having a mental breakdown about being stuck in a 14-year-old body. A conflict that didn't happen for Claudia in the book until she was 60 years old. Only took this older and more aware Claudia 5 years to get there. Lost boy never wanting to grow up? She sure isn't. It's a bit funny because when Claudia is lamenting about her child body in the book, she says, 6 more mortal years, 7, 8, and I might have had the body shape that she wanted. And for a 5-year-old bodied Claudia, 8 years would have put her right about 14, which is where the show's Claudia is now, and she's unhappy with her shape. But I guess that fits in with her character. Claudia always wants more. Episode 5 opens with Daniel and Louis enjoying their second dinner together on day 2 of their interview. Well, Louis is enjoying it. Daniel seems too repulsed by Louis's feeding to touch his rare steak. This time, Louis is sucking on Rashid's neck. But wait, Maven, you say? I thought you were convinced that Rashid's a secret vampire. Perhaps even the secret vampire? Why would Louis be drinking from him now? He has to be human after all. Or is that just what they want us to think? Is it all part of the ruse? First of all, vampires drink from each other all the time in the books. It's a different source of nourishment than human blood, and usually it's more about making an intimate psychic connection, but it does sustain them, so Louis very well could still be feeding from Rashid, even if he's a vampire. But if you watch closely, you'll notice you never see any blood. Not on Rashid's neck, not on Louis's mouth or face, and after Louis has so very established what a messy eater he is, it's odd that this time we see none of it, not even on his teeth. Rashid quickly presses a napkin to his neck before Daniel or we can see if there's any wound there, and Louis quickly puts one over his lips. And unlike how Big Burly Damek collapsed in episode 2, 138-pound Rashid is just fine after supposedly getting so much blood drawn. Louis goes on to talk about how human Rashid is and his regimented human lifestyle, the food he eats to flavor his blood for Louis's pleasure, but again, could be all to create this illusion for Daniel. The illusion that they're going through all this trouble to create for reasons? I'm starting to sound too tinfoil hatty. But then why the gloves? This guy has got to be a vampire, right? Or is that just what they want us to think? I haven't seen episode 6 or 7 yet. You all know exactly as much as I do. Anyway, while they dine, Daniel is reading the part of Claudia's diary where she writes down all her victims' last words. It's this obsession of hers, which was hinted at in the last episode, keeping this souvenir from every one of her kills, something that Lestat and Louis never do. When Daniel says that he can't think of anything more fucked up than a teen girl serial killer, Rashid challenges him, saying Daniel's work is just as bad because once the book is published, the other vampires in the world are going to come slaughter Louis for revealing their vampire secrets. Rashid calls this interview Louis' suicide, and says Daniel is just as bad as Claudia for assisting Louis in his own death, blaming Daniel for this entirely. As much as Rashid clearly does not enjoy the idea of Louis' imminent demise, saying he cares for Louis more than he cares for himself, Rashid is clearly resigned to it, and Louis dismisses him by calling him opinionated. Daniel complains that there's no way for him to fact-check Claudia's list of kills, and Louis tells him that's the point. New Orleans really was the perfect city for a vampire to get away with murder. As they dive back into their interview, Louis is moping over the fact that he thinks Claudia has been on a hunger strike for months. In her grief over losing her boyfriend Charlie and how that represented for her the complete separation of humanity and any fantasies of a human life. She apparently hasn't even come out of her coffin for months. While Lestat mournfully plays the piano, we see Louis breaking the wings of pigeons and leaving the birds in Claudia's room, hoping that she'll come out of the coffin when he's not looking and eat them. When Louis frets to Lestat that Claudia is starving herself, Lestat tells him he thinks she's just sneaking out and still killing people when they can't catch her. He wants to deal with Claudia more directly, but is grumpily refraining to allow Louis' gentle parenting style this time instead. When Louis tells Lestat that it's his fault she's doing this, Lestat has enough, and he storms into Claudia's room, throwing open her coffin to show Louis it's empty, just like he said. But not completely empty. Her diaries are in there, and Lestat begins to snoop despite Louis' admonition of violating her privacy, but when he reads a passage out loud about her contemplating her sex life, they're both extremely uncomfortable, and he storms back to his sad piano. But apparently he comes back at some point, because when Claudia sneaks back into her room after killing someone, he surprises her by popping out of her coffin and revealing he read all of her diaries. Her fathers are distressed, because the diaries reveal that she's been killing far more people than they've burned in their incinerator, and they want to know what she's done with all those bodies. When she doesn't give them an answer, Lestat pushes her against the wardrobe. Claudia is shocked by this threat of violence from him. He's never been like this with her before, always only coddling her up until the night Charlie died. She asks Louis for help, but he turns away because Lestat's told him about the cruel things she wrote about both of them. When Louis finally snaps and yells at her, she explodes, telling them she buried the bodies where no one will ever find them. She's furious at her dad's for violating her privacy, screaming that she hates them both, thinking she's done nothing wrong and she's the victim here. But what she didn't realize is that New Orleans isn't really a place where you can bury things and expect them to stay down. It's a city of no basements for a reason, famous for its graveyards full of above-ground crypts. Because of its position below sea level, any corpses buried have a nasty habit of floating back up again whenever a storm hits and makes the river rise, and this is exactly what ends up happening with the dozens and dozens of bodies Claudia left out there, causing panic to grip the city about a maniac on the loose and putting the vampires at the dangerous risk of being caught. So this conflict is very loosely based on a section of the book. In the book, after 60 years of being a perfectly responsible little murder machine, when Claudia starts to revolt against her dad's, she recklessly leaves 2 bodies of their servants in their own house's backyard kitchen. Louis and Lestat find them and they're upset with her because, well, what if they got found? It could have been so dangerous for them, but thankfully, they caught it in time and then killed the rest of the servants' family so no one noticed they were missing, so all the loose ends are tied up. It's a very emotional situation and illustrates the way their family is breaking down, leading to the drama between the 3 of them, but it doesn't provide any actual external conflict. It could have been bad for them, but they fixed it. Whew, close call. Crisis averted. The show has decided to go the route of, what if it wasn't? What if those bodies were found by the police and it did actually put the vampires in danger? And what if, instead of it being 2, it was 56? Holy shit, the stakes are high here on AMC. Louis and Lestat find out about this when they meet their old buddy Tom Anderson in a speakeasy while he's asking them to donate to his political campaign. He tells them that the reason they've seen so many cops walking the streets in the French Quarter where they live is because they're going door to door searching houses for the murderer. At first, everyone thought the flood of bodies were just people who died in the hurricane, who got washed into the bayou. But then they found out that every single one of them was missing a random body part. So they know it's a maniac keeping souvenirs, and most of the bodies come from the vampire's very own neighborhood. Louis and Lestat realize that Tom has lured them here so that their house can be searched while they're gone. Thoroughly pissed off, they use their vampire powers to freeze time, or whatever this power actually is, I still don't understand, and flee home. But too late, they find the police already inside, going through all their stuff. The deputy tells them that Claudia let them in, revealing that she is very drunk. I am still not clear about vampires drinking alcohol in this version. In a recent interview, Sam Reed mentions that Lestat only pretends to drink wine, so all those times we see them with alcohol, they're just faking it. But then, why did Rashid make Louis and Daniel 2 martinis in episode 3? Also, why does Lestat's house have a wine cellar full of illegal booze? The cop mentions it when he's leaving later, as it violates prohibition laws. This is the first time we're hearing about it in the show that airs, but in the original script for episode 1, while Louis and Lestat were hanging out, getting to know each other, and Lestat was like buying clothes and furniture, Louis also says in the script that he bought tons of wine for his wine cellar. And also a dog. Why did they cut out the dog? They could have had a family dog all this time? I don't know. Maybe Lestat went to all the trouble of installing and filling a wine cellar in his townhouse just for entertaining guests and victims. Or maybe vampires can drink and enjoy booze. We still don't know for sure. But either way, though there are empty bottles rolling around on the floor, Claudia didn't drink the spirits directly. She drank the blood of an exceedingly drunk victim, and the intoxication was passed on to her through the bloodstream. This is something that happens in the book, though here it's Lestat who drinks the drunk person. But it doesn't make him drunk in a fun way. He says it makes him dizzy and he doesn't like the feeling at all. It really is only blood that these vampires can enjoy. But the scene in the book is planting setup for how Claudia later makes a victim drink poison and then gives that victim to Lestat, so he imbibes the poison through the blood. And I'm guessing this scene with wacky drunk Claudia in the show will be similar setup for later when this Claudia tricks Lestat in a similar way. Although the show did also set up the whole vampire should never drink dead blood thing, despite that being retconned right out of the books, so maybe they'll go that route instead? We'll see. It could be something even entirely different, turning the book on its head and subverting all our expectations like it's done so far. Either way, things aren't looking so good for Lestat's future. The cops find the incinerator in the backyard, and they are highly suspicious of it, though I'm not sure why, because they aren't looking for evidence of burned bodies. They already have all the bodies. Lestat says they use it to burn waste. Refuse, which is, of course, how this Lestat thinks of humans. The waste of the world. So different from how he reveres humans in the books. On the fly, Louis makes up the lie that they are incinerator salesmen. And slick vampire that he is, Lestat easily slips into the role, improvising a sales pitch that comedically calls us back to the tractor salesman who was Louis' first victim in episode 2. The camera inside the incinerator shows us a human bone in there, and tension is high as the cops root through the ashes. But they're distracted when one of them finds Claudia's bedroom door locked. Inside, she is frantically and drunkenly collecting all the rotting body part souvenirs she saved from the victims and stuck in random places all around her room. Why Louis and Lestat never smelled them in there over all these months, I don't know. She dumps them in her coffin turntable and gleefully pulls the lamp to spin the secret panel around to hide them, but oh no, she's got a live victim stuff in her closet, the drunk guy she'd been feasting on when the cops arrived. During all this macabre vampire tension, ironically jaunty jazz music is playing in the background, perfectly summing up the tone of how these vampires defy all classic vampire expectations. In another feat of quick thinking, Claudia avoids letting the cops find the victim in her closet by pretending to be naked when they bust in, and it works. As the police leave the house, the deputy says he'll have to report them for the illegal wine cellar, but he'll give them a pass on their drunk underage daughter. For now. Pissed off, Louis plays the I'm buddies with the police chief card and threatens to get the deputy reported, but then the deputy fires back with a homophobic barb, threatening them with jail time for committing crimes against nature if he reports them for only having one bed upstairs. Louis and Lestat are rattled. This is the first time their lives as a same-sex couple has actually had the potential for any serious consequences for them, and they don't know how to respond. Their money and vampire powers can't protect them from the court of law, and homosexuality was illegal at the time. Although they'd been living as a sort of open, unspoken secret for the past 13 years with their scandalous friends in the speakeasy and brothel underground business, when it comes to maintaining their facade in decent society, it's a much trickier matter. But I have to wonder, why do they only have one bed upstairs? In the book, they both have separate bedrooms, each with their own bed, which they use for, taking naps or lounging on for reading, even though they never sleep in it during the day, only using their coffins, which were also each in their own rooms. It's not that they were only roommates in the book and that the show changed things by making them into a couple. The marriage was always there between the lines, which the later books and the author have repeated explicitly. But at the time, it's not like it was uncommon for couples to have separate rooms, even straight ones. And the townhouse is big enough. There's plenty of rooms. They don't sleep in the bed. It's up there for show to mask their real sleeping chambers in the coffin room behind the secret panel in the wall. So if the main point of the bed is to keep up the human ruse, why not just have two of them in separate rooms to help with that ruse? Considering it's right there in the book as something they actually do, it seems a bit short-sighted, but it sure is causing drama for them now. Once they're alone again, Lestat and Louis lay into Claudia for putting them in danger, where this time they almost really did get caught because she was reckless enough to keep souvenirs of her kills, including the now-dead body of the alcoholic closet victim splayed between them on the table while they have this whole big argument. Claudia is still too drunk to keep up, not really paying attention at all, and Lestat turns the fight on Louis, saying Claudia is his responsibility because Louis was the one who forced Lestat to make her a vampire in the first place. Even though Lestat has enjoyed 6 wonderful years with Claudia as his beloved daughter, after the months of her shutting them out, he now hates her. He calls her an anvil, dragging them down into the horrible depths, and said they were so happy before she came into their lives. Louis calls bullshit because they were most certainly not happy. Claudia did, in fact, very much serve as a band-aid for their shitty marriage. And it worked for 6 whole years. Not the 60 years they got in the book, but hey. Finally sobered, Claudia speaks up, confessing what her real problem is and why she's been acting so irresponsibly. She's upset because she'll never have a romantic partner of her own. Any human who would want a 14-year-old girl would either be some creepy pervert or someone much younger than she is now mentally, and she's no longer interested in little boys. Unless she can find another vampire her own age, she is doomed to a life of being a third wheel with no love of her own. Lestat coldly mocks her emotional breakdown like the bitch she is, calling her impossible. Meanwhile, Louis takes it seriously, feeling overwhelming sympathy and guilt for Claudia's loneliness. She reveals that she tried to make herself a vampire boyfriend, but it hasn't worked. In the book, Claudia is simply too small to make another vampire. She doesn't have enough of her own blood to transfer into another person to make the dark gift work. Here, she's plenty big enough, but it's still not working for some reason that they don't tell us why, and her dads are appalled that she attempted it behind their backs. She begs Lestat to make her a vampire boyfriend, saying if he doesn't, she'll run away and find other vampires. Lestat tells her it's impossible. He's the first and only vampire to ever come to America, after all. Or at least he was in the books. The show has hinted that it's the same, but it hasn't said for sure exactly. Lestat warns Claudia that other vampires would destroy her and calls her a mistake, which sparks Louis's anger, but Claudia challenges him why Louis puts up with Lestat, who's treating them both like shit. Has he been treating them like shit? Up until the Charlie incident, he seemed to be treating them just fine. I guess she just means since then, because his love for her turned so hateful over the whole hunger strike thing. In revenge, she tells Louis that Lestat's resumed his affair with Antoinette, which she knows because she's been spying on him. Yes, that's right. 7 years after Lestat dumped Antoinette, they are now back together, and Lestat was keeping it secret from Louis this time. Lestat, that's not an open marriage. That's just cheating. But of course, he thinks it doesn't count because she's just a human, which tracks with how vampires view humans in the books. Louis and Lestat are never jealous over the other fooling around with humans because humans are so separate from them. Precious beings that will be dead soon while they stay immortal. It is only when other vampires come into the romantic picture that vampires start to get jealous and afraid of losing each other. But the show has decided that human relationships are just as much of an emotional threat to them, and Louis is quite put out to hear this, feeling like the neglected housewife. Lestat says it's just entertainment, and he promises to kill Antoinette soon. Louis doesn't seem to believe him, and I don't know about you, but neither do I. In the book, Lestat keeps telling Louis that he's going to kill Antoine any night now, acting like he was just playing a sadistic game with Antoine's love, but Louis could tell there was something more going on. He never says anything about it, though, because he knows Lestat would be super pissed off if Louis ever implied that Lestat had feelings. Besides, Louis was too distracted at the time about Claudia's whole murder plan to really care much about Lestat's mortal affairs. And just like in the book, this Louis has bigger problems, and he goes after the distraught Claudia to find her packing a bag. He begs her not to leave, but she blames him for destroying her life by making her a vampire. She believes that she could have survived the fire if he took her to a hospital instead, and that she could be married with babies by now. I mean, she's only 20 by now, but sure, being a housewife was apparently the height of all her dreams, and now she'll never have a normal and comfortably mundane life. Louis instantly feels guilty over this because, of course he does, he's Louis. What he thought was his redemption, saving Claudia's life and giving her immortality, was actually a crime against her. He has doomed her to the same living hell that once tormented him in his early vampire years. And because this Claudia is 14 and fully capable of being independent, Louis sadly lets her go, and she runs off to live a solo life. Back with Daniel over an after-dinner drink, Louis admits that it was selfish of him to make Claudia a vampire, but Daniel is unsympathetic. Claudia was a vicious serial killer. He doesn't care that she was sad about not being able to sweep her husband's floors and go to church. He compares her to Charles Manson, the infamous cult leader / musician turned murderer. Manson had a sensitive musical side, but he was still a monster. He then shoots off a homophobic dig at Louis and Lestat and says he thinks Claudia will be the sensationalist key to turn their interview into a best-selling book. When Louis says they can't exploit her, Daniel explains that there's no way to predict how an audience will react to a book. They could end up making a huge deal out of Claudia or not. But by putting this book out there in the world, they're taking the risk. Even though Louis is upset enough by this to dig a hole in his extremely fancy dinner table with one of his vampire fingernails, he decides the risk is worth it to warn the world about the upcoming vampire apocalypse. Does he say anything more about this imminent vampire apocalypse or the Great Conversion? No. Back to his story, Louis and Lestat are paranoid now that the cops are watching, suspecting that they're the murderers. So they change up their whole lifestyle, going underground and living like secluded recluses, only hunting victims far out of town, not using the incinerator, not participating in society. And without Claudia there to be the bridge between them, their romance is destroyed. Lestat is convinced Claudia is gone for good, and good riddance. He's ready to dismantle her room the first night she leaves, but Louis is convinced she'll come back, and he forbids it. Lestat suggests they just move to a new city and start their life over, but when Louis asks about Paris, Lestat shoots that down and they drop it, deciding to stay hiding in New Orleans while they trudge through this unhappy, miserable, unfun life together for 7 years, missing out on the entire rest of the Roaring Twenties. Another time skip. Disappointing because I was hoping to see some cool 1920s costumes and scenery in this show. But nope, we go straight to 1930 and the Great Depression. You thought everything was brown before? The reason Lestat is so adamant against going to Paris is because he knows Paris is full of the vampires he left behind there. When he was a brand new baby vampire in Paris, he learned there was a cult of Satan-worshipping vampires who had claim to the city, and they did not like him one bit. He was just way too fabulous for them. The Satanists attacked him and tortured his human boyfriend to madness, but Lestat eventually convinced them all that being in a cult was for losers, and they decided to start a new life as actors, which became the Theater of the Vampires that Louis and Claudia eventually find when they go to Paris a century later. The leader of the satanic cult, of course, was Armand, and he and Lestat have this extremely juicy and tumultuous history together, and Lestat is rightfully smart to want to keep an ocean between all that nonsense and Louis, but of course he never tells Louis and Claudia about any of this because he's afraid that if they know where to find other vampires, they wouldn't believe him about how dangerous they are, and they'd run off and get themselves killed and leave him alone in his worst fear of loneliness. Louis spends his 7 years moping, wandering around the most dreary and destitute neighborhoods, sending out psychic messages, begging Claudia to come home, but she keeps her mind locked to him. He says he is emotionally destitute without her. She is all he wants, and Lestat means nothing to him now. Meanwhile, her diaries tell the story of how she's been traveling around the country, sneaking into college libraries to research books about vampires. At one such university, she gets caught by a pushy white college boy out in public where she can't use her vampire powers to get out of it. But before he can get her in trouble, a white guy on a motorcycle rolls up to rescue her. And surprise, he's another vampire. Back with Louis, he tells us that the Great Depression has hit the country over a panning shot of his house that's become this pigsty of junk and vermin thanks to his own depression. All he does anymore is sit around and read, and when Lestat tries to entice him to go out to a Louis Armstrong show, Louis makes cruel jabs at him. Frustrated, Lestat's like, well, at least you notice me because I've been thinking of lighting myself on fire just to get you to pay attention. Louis still blames Lestat for driving Claudia away. She is all he cares about, and Lestat storms off, sick of having the same fight for 7 years. All this neglect and squalor Louis is living in now is similar to how he lives in the books for a while, but that's during a time when he's living alone in this rotting shack, caring nothing for making his home a nice space. So I can see why he'd let his house get this messed up now, but I can't see why Lestat tolerates it. Why doesn't he just keep the house clean? He always did that just fine before Louis ever moved in. The only time Lestat ever lives in squalor in the books is after Claudia dies and Louis runs off with Armand and he's brutally injured and completely alone. This Lestat has Louis and he's glad Claudia's gone. What's his excuse? Back to Claudia. She and the new motorcycle vampire have eaten the college boy and burned his body while they get to know each other around the fire. At first, the new vampire seems pretty cool, and Claudia is so excited to finally meet another one. He tells the story of how he went off to Europe for a job and got attacked and abandoned by a vampire there and then managed to come back home to America. He thought he was the only vampire in the whole country until he heard Louis's psychic cries searching for Claudia, and he decided to track her down himself, hoping he could form a gang of vampires to hunt in a pack, a found family of his own, which he jokingly calls a fang gang. When he tells Claudia his name is Bruce, she thinks that's a dumb name for a vampire, and she gives him the nickname Killer. And now we know exactly who this guy is. Killer is a vampire from the book Queen of the Damned. He was made in the 1920s, just like Bruce here, and by the 1980s, he has actually formed that vampire gang he was dreaming about. The 5 people in his gang ride around the country on their motorcycles with custom matching jackets that say Fang Gang. Only instead of just like joining up with other vampires he's found around the country, he's actually the maker of everyone in his biker gang. And he nurtures his fledglings, teaching them all in vampire ways. Most of the vampires in that book get destroyed by Akasha's reign of terror in 1985, but Killer survives and afterwards meets up with none other than Antoine, who has been alone ever since Lestat left him to go back to Europe in 1871 to ask Armand to heal his injuries after Louis kind of set him on fire. Lestat had wanted Antoine to go with him. He did actually care about Antoine, but Antoine was too scared to make the journey across the ocean, so he spent the next 100 years roaming around America when he wasn't sleeping. Running into Killer, Antoine shares his sad life story, and Killer tells him about how all the vampires are converging again because a new threat is now destroying all the vampires around the world, again in 2013. Though they separate, they do both eventually end up going to New York City, where Armand and Louis are living together again, and get taken in by them and live in Armand's fabulous mansion for a while. After Louis and Antoine eventually moved to France to live with Lestat in 2014, Killer stays in New York with Armand until one day, an alien from outer space shows up and kills him and eats his brain. Is Anne Rice okay? Weird is what you signed up for. Rest in peace, Killer. I'll pour one out for your delicious sparkly brain. Of course, in the books, he never met Claudia because he was made decades after she died in the 1870s. But here, they're having a fine time bonding over their awful European makers until Killer Bruce starts to get kind of weird. Pretty creepy. He hands Claudia a book he thinks she should read, which is Emily Post's Book of Etiquette. And he really thinks a young lady like her should follow such rules of manners and therefore let him do anything he wants to her because refusing him would be rude. And the scene quickly turns horrific when he breaks her leg and it's implied that sexual assault is imminent. A complete flip from the fatherly and nurturing Killer in canon who says books like Emily Post and Miss Manners are the stupidest things he's ever seen. But yeah, the show is actually referencing the same Emily Post book that Killer just casually mentions one night in Queen of the Damned. Does it count as an Easter egg if they use it in the exact opposite way it is in canon? They did take his name Bruce from Post's birth name, Emily Bruce Price, so there's that. Before we can see what happens to Claudia, the scene cuts back to Daniel, who discovers
there are 4 pages torn out.
He knows it's not something she would do and is angry at Louis for withholding information, even it's for some noble cause like keeping her assault from being exploited. Daniel says it makes him have to call into question every single other thing they've discussed in the interview. And he was so on board with accepting Louis as a reliable narrator this time that he threw out the tapes. But this is a hard line for Louis, and when Daniel gets too pushy, Louis uses his vampire powers to make Daniel's arm shake as if it's the worst Parkinson's tremor he's ever experienced. Daniel panics, but thankfully Rashid appears and instantly calms Louis. He tries to apologize for Louis, but Daniel gets up and smacks Louis in the face for daring to prey on his vulnerability, his own worst fear. Once he's got that out of his system, they tersely continue the interview. I didn't think it was possible, but Louis's house has become even more a pit of squalor as he sprawls in bed in his pajamas amid a pile of trash crawling with rats that he casually grabs and eats. He is obsessively scanning newspapers for news of murders that might lead him to tracking down Claudia. Lestat, meanwhile, is fully dressed in a sharp suit and ignores Louis's rambling to look out the window where Antoinette is waiting for him on the street below. It's been 7 years since he promised Louis he would kill her soon, so they're either back together again or have still been going this whole time. My guess is back together again because Lestat had also been wallowing in his pajamas, waiting and waiting and waiting for Louis to notice him, and then finally hit his breaking point in the last scene when he was also looking out the window. time to go ring up his ex-girlfriend. Of course, she's 13 years older now than when Lestat had his first affair with her, but age has never mattered to Lestat. He gives Louis one last chance, entreating him to pay attention to him, and when Louis completely ignores him, Lestat gives up and goes out with Antoinette. But it doesn't seem to help much, because later we see Lestat sulking forlornly in the street, alone, underneath the balcony where Louis is still obsessively sending out psychic pleas to Claudia to come home. I love this shot of Lestat leaning against the pole because it reminds me of the cover art of the Vampire Lestat graphic novel. He's just a trench coat wearing pole leaner, that Lestat. The only thing that can get Louis to put on pants and leave the house is a phone call from his sister in October of 1930, asking to meet him at the graveyard. There, she tells him that she lost everything in the stock market crash, so she and her family are leaving town, and as a final goodbye, she's had Louis's name added to the family crypt, declaring him dead. She knows he's not human, can see he hasn't aged in 20 years, and she doesn't think he's her brother anymore, but some demon who's taken him over. He's dead to her now. A nice detail here when we see the birth and death dates on the tombstone. His birthday is October 4th, and this is actually Louis's canonical birthday. It was also Anne Rice's birthday. It was never mentioned in the books or anything, but Anne Rice made it official many years back via word of God that Louis shares her birthday and Lestat shares her husband Stan's birthday, November 7th. After Grace leaves, Louis, distraught, dissolves into tears over the grave. The last specks of his human life finally stomped out for good. Meanwhile, Claudia has come back to town and is spying on him, saying that all meaning has disintegrated from her life without Louis and Lestat, and she has this epiphany that the reason they made her was because Louis needed a replacement sister. This touches her heart enough to finally come home. She's 27 years old now, able to return with a new sense of maturity and purpose. Louis is languishing on the couch reading Chérie by Colette, which is a novel known for being very French and very luxurious about two lovers reaching the end of the most intense love affair of their life, ready to let go. But neither lover understands how deeply they are attached or how much they will give up by parting ways. Foreshadowing for the tragedy that will be Louis and Lestat's imminent epic breakup. When Claudia walks in, she and Louis embrace in a tearful reunion. Until Lestat ruins the moment with a literal record scratch as he stops the Victrola. Claudia apologizes to him for bringing in the police's suspicion upon them and ruining their lives, but Lestat is not here for it. She tells him about the vampire folklore book she's been studying and says she plans to travel to Eastern Europe ASAP to track down the legends and find other vampires. And this is something Claudia does in the book too, though she does all of her research without ever leaving New Orleans and never tells Lestat about it. She keeps all her plans secret between her and Louis. When Lestat asks her why she even bothered coming home if she's just leaving again right away, she says it's because she's taking Louis with her. This shocks both of them, and Lestat defensively mocks her research. She demands he tell her the truth about other vampires, and he says that they are vicious, which triggers her trauma about what Killer did to her. Lestat picks up on it immediately and mocks her weakness like the bitch she is, telling her the vampires in Europe are even worse. As he ridicules her, Louis looks on, caught in a state of inaction between the two of him, but his guilt for cursing Claudia with vampirism rises, and when Claudia starts using her mental voice to beg Louis to come with her and to be free of Lestat's controlling oppression, Louis considers it. He doesn't say anything aloud, but Lestat can see it on his face that Louis is thinking of leaving him to go with her, and his temper explodes. Lestat has been waiting around for 7 years for Louis to get over Claudia so that they can have their marriage back. And he's furious with Claudia for making Louis so miserable and anguished for so long. And he can't stand that Louis would just forgive her immediately for abandoning them and just run off with her when Lestat was the one who stayed by his side through all of his worst times. Lestat grabs Claudia and pins her to the cabinet, mirroring what he did at the beginning of the episode. Only this time, he's violently crushing her throat, and Louis snaps out of it and tackles Lestat to save her. What follows here is a vampire fight of epic proportions, with the two of them smashing through the furniture, throwing each other across the room until Lestat gets the better of Louis, sitting on him and punching his face over and over again, much to Claudia's horror. And mine too. My horror? What the hell is this? This is just so unlike anything that ever happens between them in the book. Lestat would never. They have their rows sometimes, but Lestat takes out his anger on the furniture, never hitting Louis or hurting him. There's like one time when Louis is like a brand new vampire and getting all hysterical over it, and Lestat like slaps him to snap him out of it. But other than that, the most they ever do is like grab hold to pull each other back, never actual assault. There is a part in the books where Lestat does sit on someone and punch them in the face over and over again, but it's not Louis, it's Armand. And part of that whole juicy, tumultuous past between them that I mentioned. And Lestat is only even doing it to Armand because Armand has just raped him. Claudia pulls Lestat off, which gives Louis the chance to tackle Lestat, and they fly up the stairs, smashing everything along the way, the piano crunching, the entire house coming down around them. As Claudia frantically limps after, we hear Lestat begging Louis to stop fighting with him, saying he's trying to restrain himself. Lestat doesn't want to use his full supreme vampire strength on Louis because if he did, he could utterly destroy him. Things go silent, and Claudia hears Louis' voice in her head saying it's okay and they're done fighting, but it sounds like he's being strangled to death while he's talking. And then suddenly, the two of them burst straight through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man. Ooh, yeah. And they launch out the second-story window, landing in the yard where Claudia finds Lestat dragging an oozingly blood-drenched Louis along the ground by his jaw. He's got his vampire claws dug up in Louis' dislocated jaw, dragging him out to the street, all while going on about how he's always fought his violent nature and controlled his temper to never once harm Louis, even though he apparently wanted to 1,000,000 times over the past 20 years. When Claudia begs him to let Louis go and take her instead, Lestat says, "No, bitch," and chomps down on Louis' throat, draining his blood as he shoots off into the sky like a rocket. The first time we've seen him use the cloud gift since that night he first drank Louis' blood, and they floated on air as they fell in love. This is not the way I wanted that to come full circle. Way up in the sky, like a mile above the earth, Lestat begs Louis to just be honest with him and tell him that he'll never love Lestat. He says it will make things easier for him if he can just give up hope of ever having Louis love him back. And this was when I realized that he's right. We have never once heard Louis tell Lestat any words of love, and Lestat has been waiting for it for 20 years. But Louis won't say it. Instead, all he says is, "Let go of me." Whether he doesn't realize he's up in the sky and what that means, or whether he's being metaphorical and he just means like, "Let me go off to Europe with Claudia, love me enough to let me go." Lestat, who can never say no to Louis, who does everything for Louis, who can deny him nothing, lets go of him. And Louis falls a mile back down to earth where he crashes through the bricks to smash to the ground, a broken, mangled wreck in their backyard. Wow, Lestat has really good aim. Claudia is distraught, but Louis' eyelid twitches, so we know he's still in there. And as she's sobbing over his destroyed body, Lestat slowly descends into the yard, looking like an absolute cold-hearted villain in the all-black clothes he was conveniently wearing tonight. And Claudia looks up at him with impotent fury, because now she can't take Louis with her to Europe. Now he's too damaged, and he'll have to stay here with Lestat, and she's just as trapped as he is. This shockingly horrific, traumatic scene has been underscored the whole time by this heartbreakingly sorrowful and dramatic orchestral string music. But then the mood is yanked right out from under us when the soundtrack cuts to a plucky, upbeat folk song about being happy in your home. And if the lyrics and tone of this song weren't ironic enough, there's a whole nother level added to it when you realize this is one of Charles Manson's songs, the very same musician/Manson family murderer Daniel compared Claudia to earlier in the episode. The vampire here is a state of entrapment, the inability to escape. Even though this Claudia is old enough to be independent, she still can't ever be free because her life has no meaning without her vampire companions. Her soul longs to be with them. She is incomplete without them, no matter how unhappy they make her. Can't live with them, can't live without them. Hell is other people. Or as she so calmly puts it in the book, locked together in hatred. All Louis's illusions of redemption are as shattered now as his body. He is only all the more guilty for his sins of selfishness, and the grave he's dug for himself only goes deeper and deeper. What's to come in episode 6? Your guess is as good as mine. After this wild, unexpected change to canon, it could be anything. There were plenty of tiny things in this episode still linked to the books, like Lestat calling Claudia infant death, and Killer's cameo, though I doubt we'll see him again unless they bring the same actor back for the season they end up doing Queen of the Damned, which will probably be 3 at the earliest, maybe not even till season 4. But for the big parts, the character growth and the plot arcs, the show has gone so far in its own direction here that I would not be surprised if it keeps spinning off into who knows where along the way before settling back down to the season finale of Claudia killing Lestat and her and Louis running off to Europe. If it even still does that. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and when episode 6 airs next weekend on AMC+, I will actually be in New Orleans at the Anne Rice Vampire Lestat Fan Club of Vampire Ball. Will you be there? If you see me there, please say hi. I will also be attending the Dark Gift Alliance Resurrection event and the subsequent Anne Rice Memorial Service, as well as the Second Line Parade in her honor that weekend. So many vampire things to do. But you better believe we'll be pausing the party to watch episode 6 as soon as it drops. Video about episode 6 will obviously be a few days late since I can't prepare it ahead of time like I did with these last 5 videos I made for you. But if you are eager to see any of my content ASAP, my Patreon patrons get early access to my videos before they go public. By joining my Patreon, you'll also help support the Vampire Discord server, as well as the Vampire Book Club. And if you're interested in joining any of those things, Patreon or not, the link to everything is in the description of this video and all my videos. Scroll down and click, and I will see you there.